Hi, and welcome to the farm. Today we're talking homesteading and composting, and my guest is Ash. Welcome, Ash.
Thank you so much for having me.
There's no trouble at all. I absolutely love your product, the Monty Composting Probe. So please introduce yourself, your company, your product, and everything about you.
So today we're talking about composting, which is what I do with my company, Monty Compost. Basically, what we've made is a little gadget that you stick in your compost and it tracks the process that's going on in there and then helps kind of analyze that data to tell you all about your composting. So I kind of started Monty several years ago now when I was first kind of learning about, what composting can do. I found out about how much impact it has and how much importance it has in our food systems, in just everyday life. 50% of the waste that we produce, a lot more if you're at a farm, is organic waste. And composting is basically just a way of sustainably managing that. And when I say sustainably, obviously, it's in an eco-friendly way, but it's also sustainably in terms of, you're getting an end product out of it, which is a fertilizer that you can use on the farm. It's sustainable in terms of you're not having as much waste collected from your property. It's just a much better way of managing this, waste you're inevitably going to produce. And, I had no background in composting. So I think when I found out about it and how much impact it has, I was just kind of hooked. So yeah, I started Monty. And then, it took a long time to get the product working. But when we did last year, we started kind of looking for the best applications for it. And one of those was obviously, those avid home composters, whether it's a little tumbler or whether it's a big bay or a pile. And obviously people who have their own farms, their own properties, they're some of the most avid composters out there. They're the ones who do it the best. So yeah, we just started finding some of the coolest ones in Australia and reaching out to them. We are a fully Australian started, made, manufactured business. And it's so amazing to work with people like Katja. And that's why I was so happy to be invited on and to chat more about composting. She's been an incredible user and we're just so happy to be working together.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I was, when I first got in contact with Ash and we were talking, and again before today's interview, I moved from a cool climate where composting kind of did its own thing into marrying a farmer, moving to the farm, moving to a hot, dry farm, and then being like, I still have all this stuff that I want to compost. And as you all know, like, I'm an avid gardener. We've got our veggie patch set up. We've got our orchard set up. How can I best utilize everything in my compost when I can't get it to compost in this new environment? And the probe has been an absolute game changer for that.
Oh, that's so great to hear. And it's so true though. And I feel like one part of kind of our work at Monty is to really push that narrative that if you're a gardener, that should be synonymous with composter. You're, as a gardener, you're producing so much amazing outcomes, but you're also producing heaps of waste and cuttings and weeds, and you're also extracting from the soil that you need to be restoring. And compost is just this amazing part of that kind of cycle of returning what you do as a gardener, all the extractions that you make from the garden, and putting it back in there. So I definitely think that bringing compost more into the gardening narrative is super important.
Absolutely. And before we continue, Ash, we're going to head into today's sponsor, which is Monty.
I've been an environmentalist since before I can remember, but not once during 15 years of activism did I come across anyone talking about how compost has the potential to play a major role in combating climate change. Every year, we collectively send over 1 billion tonnes to landfill and another 2 billion from agriculture. When sent there, it produces immense amounts of what are called high warming potential greenhouse gases, which have far greater heat trapping than carbon and are responsible for around 5% of global emissions. But composting, it stops all of this by managing the decomposition in a way that prevents both pollution and emissions. It has never been easier, more accessible, more affordable, more exciting for everyone, everywhere, to be a composter.
Working with Katja has been so good, and we've actually been able to put together an amazing offer for all of her listeners, for all of you out there who are maybe looking to get more engaged with your composting, do it better. So if you go to our website, you can actually order a Monty monitor and use the special discount code for this particular show, which we'll put in the show notes, I imagine. It's a lot easier to click through that link or you can just type in the rural mum. So yeah, so it's a really great tool, like you were saying, in terms of composting better, especially if you're in a challenging environment, especially if you need to be tracking those things like the temperature and staying on top of everything. It's really handy for that. Or if you're a really avid composter or you're new and you just want to learn more about it, it can be really helpful for that too.
Absolutely. On a lot of rural properties and places, we don't have garbage collection. So we are needing to control our waste or take it somewhere by adding, elements to the compost, particularly if we're producing too much that we can't give to, our animals or our chooks or our pigs or anything like that, our goats. Then composting is another great way to reduce that waste removal from the farm. It's staying here, it's becoming well used, and we're becoming more self-sufficient on farm.
That is such a good point. And I think it really ties into that just holistic sustainability of waste management. And when you're on a farm, it is just going to be hard. Like, you're not getting the daily or weekly waste collection like you do in cities. And you want to really be making the most out of, what is effectively a resource. Like, it's waste, but it's also got all these nutrients in it that you can find use for as long as they're processed.
Yeah. So Ash, can you tell us the different types of composting setups? We touched on it briefly with like a tumble or a pit or something like that. So can you tell us the different types and why they might benefit different farms or different people?
Of course. So, also just to preface that, there are so many different ways of composting. So I've been in this space for like almost 5 years, and literally every single person compost setup I see is so different, whether it's a household, whether it's a farm, whether it's a school, community garden. Every kind of way of doing it is so different, just because all of us are different. So just to preface it there. So don't ever feel like there's a right or wrong way. So depending on, I'll kind of give a few categories.
Yeah.
You can have something like a tumbler or a bin, which is usually a smaller container-based composting system. And so basically that's really good if you've got a fairly small amount of kitchen waste, of, maybe some small amounts of green garden waste. But if you're on a farm, you are going to be filling up those containers very quickly. You're going to be producing probably animal manure as well, a lot more green waste, like large volumes. So unless you're a very small producer, I would say that probably I have actually seen some properties that have lots of different, lots of containers. So they'll be producing, a few hundred tons of organic waste a month. And the way that they deal with that, they haven't upgraded to a larger composting setup. They just keep adding new bins. So they have something like 20 bins on site that they just keep filling up. And so you can do that. But usually for a farm, if you're producing a lot of organic waste, what your best bet is going to be something like what's called a bay or a pile. And so a bay is basically like a structure. You can make it out of pallets, or you can make it out of, just anything you've got lying around. But it's basically just kind of like an enclosed structure that you're going to be storing your organic waste in. You're going to be building it up like you're supposed to with a compost pile, monitoring it, managing it, and just kind of controlling that organic waste decomposition process. Likewise, because those bays, they're a lot bigger, you can control the size. They'll usually be, a meter by a meter by a meter, so quite large, as opposed to your bins or tumblers, which are probably like less than 200 kgs. Or you can also do a pile, which is literally what it sounds like. It's just piling up your organic waste. Now, these can get a little bit cumbersome. So really depending on what your waste stream is. So if you have like a lot of manure in your waste, or a lot of just dried leaves, that's going to affect whether you choose a bay or a pile. There are a lot of factors that play into what your best setup would be. But I think personally, for anyone who's getting new into it, especially if you're coming from a farm, the best place to start is, what is the volume of waste that I'm producing? Because that's going to tell you, okay, I need a larger setup, or I can go with just something off the shelf in a bin or a tumbler.
Yeah.
Is that kind of a good starting point?
Yeah, great starting point. Excellent. So I do want to step into ratios, because when I first started looking at composting, I got really confused about the ratios, particularly moving from the cool climate to the hot climate, because they change a little bit, don't they?
Oh my God, they change so much. And that is also something that I got really confused by. And being a very scientific person, I tried to go into all the volumes and the decimal points and get everything calculated properly. And sometimes I enjoyed it, sometimes I got really slack with it, but I can imagine it's just so like unmanageable for the everyday person trying to compost efficiently, especially when you're on a farm and you're trying to manage all these other things. So basically, the ratio of your compost, for anyone who's not kind of aware, I like to compare it to a balanced diet for your compost, kind of like it is for us. Like, we have to, what is it? It's like 3 to 5 serves of fruit and veggies for however, you remember like the food pyramid.
The food pyramid.
It's like a food pyramid, but for your compost. In this particular case, all your balancing are your nitrogen-rich materials. So I think of that as anything that's fresh. Anything that has recently been living, then that is going to be very rich in nitrogen materials. And then you've got your carbon-rich materials. And so that's something that's probably been dead for a lot longer. And so the balance of carbon and nitrogen, getting that right, you need to get that to a certain point for effective composting, because that's the diet of the microbes that do all the decomposition. That is the composting process. If they have too much nitrogen in their diet, then they're not going to be able to consume it. And what's going to happen is that nitrogen will volatilize, and it will come up as it'll gasify as an odor, or it'll leach into the kind of liquids that come out of your compost, and you'll lose it. Vice versa, if you have too much carbon, if you have too much carbon, then that means you don't have enough nitrogen, and the microbes won't be able to grow and be successful, and your compost pile will be really slow. So having the right balance of that, not too gassy and odorous and smelly, and not too slow, is really the art/science of composting.
Yeah.
And so that's a little context on what the ratio is. And so now to the practicalities of how do you manage it. There's kind of two approaches. So firstly, you can go front end and you can balance it based on what you're putting into your compost. So I know that I put in a bucket of kitchen waste. I have to balance that out with 2 buckets of, brown waste, of leaves, of dried kind of garden waste. So that's the front end way of doing it. That can be where it can sometimes be a little bit tricky. The back end way of doing it is when you do it based on kind of response. So you just build up your compost pile with whatever. You go back the next day and check it and you say, okay, there's way too much odor. I've clearly put in too much nitrogen. Let's balance it out with some brown stuff. Come back the next day. Now there's nothing happening. Okay, I might need to put a bit more nitrogen in it. So that's kind of how there's two different approaches to getting that balance right. Usually it's a combination of both, but I always found it very overwhelming. And so that's kind of what we're trying to do with Monty, is allow people to build up their pile however they want. And then Monty just kind of tells you, well, this is out of whack, so this is what you need to add. But yeah, it is a constant process, because like you said before, the climate can affect what the ratio needs to be. The feedstock that you're putting in can affect it. The type of setup you have can affect it. And just as an example of that, if you have like, usually your compost moisture comes from the feedstock that you put in, the waste. So if you're in a really dry climate, you may need to put in more moisture. If you have a enclosed tumbler as opposed to a pile, you may need to reduce the amount of moisture, because all of it's staying in there versus in a pile, it's seeping out into the ground. Yeah. So there are so many things to consider when it comes to the ratio. And I feel like I've just been rambling on, so I'm so sorry, but I could literally just talk about this for hours. But yeah, so that's kind of the overview of ratios and how you can kind of approach it.
Yeah. And so when we receive our probe, we can actually select to add our weather to it, so we can set it to our postcode.
Yes.
So the probe itself is reading the weather of what we've had. Is that how that works?
Yeah, so we actually get the weather from a local weather station, and we kind of combine that, because the probe does read temperature and gases and air moisture. But obviously, if you're in like a pile, for example, if you're in like an open pile or something, that can be affected by the local weather. So depending on how out of kind of scope your local weather is, it makes some adjustments to the probe readings to make sure that they're actually accurate, so of your composting. So it is really challenging trying to get every single postcode's weather correct, because especially when you start to get out to the regional areas, a postcode can just be huge. Yeah. So that's actually a feature that we're trying to figure out the best next steps on. But yeah, there are so many kind of new things that we're trying to build in, just so that we can make sure we've got something that fits every kind of composter, who, like I said before, are so unique.
Yeah. Excellent. So Ash, can you talk us through setting up the probe and how we can use that so that the audience can visualize how this could benefit them, because we've gone quite broadly through, the composting and the probe. So can you tell me, more specifically, we've received it, we're going to set it up, and how is that going to benefit us going forward? How are we going to read the results?
So getting set up with Monty is super easy. Like I said, we've kind of designed the whole thing to make it, workable with any kind of composter, really adaptable. So when you get it, you've got, as you know, your little Monty box. You'll see, where is it? Here. It is actually made in Australia. So we have a facility that we work with in the Gold Coast who builds it and does all of that stuff. So it's really cool being able to offer that aspect of it. But basically, you just get your Monty and it's all in there. So for our viewers, it is basically just this really simple two-part system where you have the stem, kind of the probe part, which is where you stick this into your compost, and it basically positions all the smart part relative to your compost. Now, we have had a few cases. Oh, sorry, yeah?
That's okay. What I was going to say is for those who are listening to it on the podcast, what the Monty looks like is
Oh,
a
yes.
long mushroom. So the stem actually looks like a mushroom stem, and then the top looks like the bulb of the mushroom. Yeah.
It does, doesn't it? That's such a good analogy. One thing we've actually found is that for those composters who have really massive piles, so some of them actually have been using their Monty with a probe, like just one of those PVC pipes that they've gotten from Bunnings, and then just stuck this into. And now the reason for that is that this is where all the sensors and smarts are on the Monty, in the top mushroom part.
In the top of the mushroom. Yep.
Exactly. And so all of those sensors, they read the temperature, the odorous gases, and the air moisture that comes out of your pile. So the reason I mentioned that before is that if you have a really big pile and sometimes you want to read the actual real internal readings of the pile, they just poke that through to get those out. But for most piles that are kind of a reasonable size, this is sufficient length. But yeah, so basically this smarts just sits on top, you stick it into your compost, and it comes turned on. There are no buttons. There's nothing to fiddle with on the Monty, which I think is a great part of the design. The reason for that was in our first version, we had all of these like charging ports, and it was really fancy. And, you know, we were looking at doing buttons and screens, and then all of the prototypes just kept failing. And the reason for that, imagine putting your phone into the compost. All of them, they were getting ants inside the electronics. The batteries were corroding because there was so much moisture, and it was just really tough. So what we've done with this is that the entire unit is sealed in. When it comes time to charge, which is every 4 to 6 weeks, depending on how often you're connecting to it, you just place it on the wireless charger, which is included. And yeah, then all of it is just done through connecting on our mobile app.
Yeah.
So I'll get that open now. But yes, oh, you've already got it. Perfect. I've got mine too. So basically it syncs up with your monitor. Depending on how regularly you sync, it can take anywhere from like 10 seconds to a minute to maybe more. But that's because the Monty stores around a month, oh, sorry, not a month, 3 months worth of data on board. So if you haven't connected in a while, it may take a couple minutes. But you basically see here that you have all of these data points that are relevant to your composting. Mine's just syncing up now, but I'll get a screen. So here, for example, you can see that this is the odorous gases that come off your compost. And it's currently in the range of unhealthy. So I had this in my pile at home. It's been in the unhealthy gas range. And what we give you is a little analysis of that data saying, you know, your compost gases have not been ideal. Here's what's wrong. Here's how you could potentially fix it. And it's as simple as that. Now, if you're interested in tracking your compost temperature, it does that too. If you're interested in looking into kind of the overall health, you can see a combined analysis. We're also actually releasing a feature this week, which is exciting, that gives you achievements based on your composting. So achievements on how often you're doing it, on how well you're doing it. There's also notifications to remind you to do it. So there really is just this whole suite of features once you get set up on the app, once you have the monitor here, that really just gets you to that expert compost level. So that's kind of our whole premise with Monty is, you know, you're still having to build the pile yourself, you're still having to get the setup, but Monty is just this companion to your composting that helps you do it a lot better, that helps you be more engaged with it and understand what's going on.
So you said it can contain up to 3 months worth of data. So does that mean you can leave the probe in all the time?
You leave the probe in 24/7 and you see all your data, how it's been. You can so you could leave it there, come back to it in a week and see how it's been every single day. I think that is one of the great things that separates Monty from some of those more basic like thermometers and probes that are out there that don't really do anything more than tell you the temperature when you check it. Monty tells you the temperature even when you're not there, along with all these other great things.
Yeah, absolutely. And so if you buy more than one Monty at a time, how do you know which one you're connecting to, which is in your compost and which one is still sitting in the box?
So there is a light at the top that, I don't know if you can see it flashing here. There you go.
Yeah, it's green.
So when it's connected, you get a solid blue light. When it is not, it will be flashing or off. And when you are with the app, you can create piles and attach the Monty to each one and then switch between Montys that you're connected to. So we are always working to improve that whole kind of experience of switching between different devices. It can be a little tricky because there's no button on the monitor, but we've got a bit of a workaround in that way where you just connect through the app.
Yeah, absolutely. Wonderful. Do I have any other questions? Is there anything that we should not be adding to our composting pile?
Oh, I do actually love this question. I am very much of the camp where anything goes. So a lot of people not a lot, but some people into composting, they're very selective. They're like, you can't put citrus in, you can't put manure in. I'm very much in the camp where it's like, if it's organic, it goes in the compost. Like even things that have like a little bit of contamination, like a little bit of plastic contamination, whether it's a shiny, what's it called? A shiny magazine or, something like that, that you're not certain of. The thing about compost is that for compost to be negatively impacting like your plants or something like that, there has to be a lot of the contaminant. And when you're composting, just the way that the organic volumes break down is that any contaminants are going to be in such a small amount. Now, the way that especially if you're doing a lot of big composting, there can be things to be cautious of. So for example, animal manure, sometimes it's important to be just a little cautious when you're composting that because it can have, some pathogens in it. It can have small, but again, this is in very, very small amounts. It's not going to kill you. So if there is something that you're uncertain of or you're a little bit cautious of, like I said, manure, sometimes also green waste that may have seeds or, weeds in it that you don't want to proliferate. What I do is I just make a separate kind of dirty compost bin where all the kind of stuff that I'm uncertain of, that can go in there. If I'm using compost on kind of crops or produce based like gardening, then I'll make sure that everything is like clean and there's no weird things in there. But for all the other stuff, for compost that you might just use on, normal land or for soil rehabilitation, then just chuck it in. Anything goes. Yeah, I'm definitely in that area though. I know a lot of people might bite my head off for that, but I think that the thing is that like it's not going to kill your compost. And I think that it's far more beneficial to take the attitude that everything organic goes in the compost than umming and ahhing, filling up your general waste bin with stuff that could be going back into your soil, but instead now it's going to landfill. We actually did this, like we were looking into the different weights of like when microplastics get into your compost, which is obviously terrible and there's microplastics everywhere. But if those microplastics were to affect you, you would actually have to be eating your compost to process it. So it doesn't actually transfer up to your plants when you put it on soil. So that's another one that there is a lot of kind of talk about that people are concerned with, but it's not actually a huge concern. You're getting microplastics and a lot worse stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. So Ash, if we were on farm and we were producing, particularly out of the homestead, a lot more green matter, if we were ordering in on bulk some of our foods, we would get, a fair bit of cardboard
Mm.
or so, some, letters in the mail. Are we able to
Mhm.
compost those letters or the cardboard?
Absolutely. So I think a good rule of thumb for one thing I always say for things that are maybe printed or they have things like they have dyes on them is what I say is like, okay, could a 2-year-old speaking of having a little baby around, could a baby get their hands on this material and put it in their mouth? If yes, then it's not toxic. So a lot of, I think that's a really great way to identify whether something's going to be toxic for a compost bin. Would it be toxic for your 2-year-old? All of these manufacturers who have cardboards and papers, they have incredibly strict regulations around around the dyes, around the chemicals they use in it. There's not going to be anything that's going to kill your plants on paper or cardboard. What I do is I'll just put the thing in there. And then when it comes time to sift and use the compost at the end, I'll just sift out any plastics like that. And because a really good point there is the reason why it's not a huge problem to have small amounts of plastic in your compost is the same reason why plastic is such a big pollution problem. When it's in compost, even the most active, hot, decomposing compost, it's still not going to break down. It's literally just going to sit there inert, not doing anything. So I don't think it's a huge problem. And definitely using those cardboards, that paper, it reduces the amount of waste that needs to go off farm. And it also provides a really great source of carbon rich materials for your compost microbes. So that's
Yeah.
kind of the short answer.
Absolutely. That's really, really good. So, Ash, we're coming to the end of the interview. Was there anything that you wanted our listeners to know, particularly about Monty?
So I think about Monty, I probably just calling back to that point I made before. And, it's not just gardeners, but also farmers, as stewards of the land,
Yeah.
it's kind of, I really do think that compost just needs to come into the conversation more and become a default. And obviously, I'm biased saying that everyone should compost, but I mean, it really is the whole reason I started this and got into this, is because especially if we're growing, if we're extracting from the land, for our own sake, to make sure that we can continue using that land, we need to be restoring nutrients back into it, putting those materials back into the soil, completing that circle of life. And composting is really just composting yourself is the cheapest, easiest way to do it. And it's just and when you get engaged with it, it's such a rewarding process. Like, I love going out to my compost and seeing how it changes day to day or even week to week. And then just knowing that I'm actually doing something good. It's such a big sustainability impact. It's so good for cost savings. If farmers are buying in fertilizer, potentially you can start to reduce those costs if you're producing it yourself. If you've got to pay or spend half a day driving all your waste off site, it's going to be a lot easier if you're only doing that once a quarter versus once a month. So I really think that it has to be part of your operation if you're on a farm. And Monty is a great way to do that. And use the code for this show, because we've got a little surprise. We are actually increasing the discount amount from 5 to 10% for listeners of this podcast, which is really exciting. So thank you so much for having me. And also, we're always just here for any sort of compost questions. We're a fully Australian started, design, made business, and we're really just working to help everyone everywhere compost.
Thank you, Ash, for being on the podcast. And thank you for all our listeners being here today. Remember to like, subscribe, and reach out. Leave any comments that came up for you in this conversation, and we'll get back to you. Until next time, thank you very much for joining us.